The fluorescent lights in the basement archive room had been humming at the wrong pitch for 3 weeks, a thin, grinding whine that settled somewhere behind the eyes and stayed there. Maren Calloway had stopped noticing it the way she stopped noticing most things about the Voss Group's lower offices, the way the carpet smelled of old coffee and photocopier toner, the way the ventilation pushed cold air exclusively at the spot where her desk sat, the way no one knocked before walking through. She noticed these things once, registered them, folded them into the category of things that were simply true about her world, and moved on. She was good at that, filing away what could not be changed. She sat at the metal desk with the rolling chair that leaned slightly left, and she pulled the next accordion folder from the stack beside her and began to work. The stack was tall. It was always tall. The partners upstairs called it the backlog. Maren called it Tuesday. Her fingers moved efficiently, sorting, date stamping, logging entries into the shared drive under the subdirectory labeled Archive Passive, which was where documents went when someone upstairs decided they were no longer urgently anyone's problem. She had dark hair she kept twisted up in a clip that was 2 years past replacement, and she wore a gray cardigan over a black blouse that was cut wide and fell past her hips, the kind of garment chosen to announce its own inoffensiveness. She was 28 years old, and she was very good at being inoffensive. The Voss Group's legitimate face was commercial real estate and property management, 12 buildings across the city, contracts and lease filings and quarterly audits, the kind of paperwork that made most people's eyes glaze by page 3. It did not make Maren's eyes glaze. Numbers had always spoken to her in a register that felt more like music than math, and she heard patterns in data the way other people heard rhythm. She had a master's degree in forensic accounting that she kept in a frame in her apartment where no one at work would see it, because she had learned early that being overqualified for a basement position made people uncomfortable rather than curious. So she filed. She filed everything they brought her, and she did it with impeccable precision, and she was, by every measure that mattered in the lower offices of the Voss Group, completely invisible. It was a Wednesday in November when the first file made her stop. Not stop filing. Maren did not stop filing in the way that other people did not stop breathing. She stopped in the interior sense, the way a tuning fork stills itself the moment the correct frequency hits. The document was a standard vendor payment record, one of 12 in the folder, attached to a property management contract for a building on Haverstone Street, nothing that should have flagged. The amounts were modest enough to pass unremarkable review, but she had processed the Haverstone Street building's invoices before. She had processed every vendor invoice for every building in the portfolio over the past 14 months, and she knew the utility service code that should have been attached to this payment. It wasn't. A different service code sat in the field, 3 digits transposed, a code that corresponded to a vendor in the system that Maren had never seen generate a contract or a service order. She set the document aside. She kept filing. At the end of her shift, she pulled up the vendor registry in the archive drive and ran the code. The vendor was registered. It had a tax ID number and a street address and a contact name and a payment history going back 22 months. It had never produced a single invoice with a corresponding work order. She sat with that information for a long moment in the buzzing cold of the archive room. Then she opened a secondary spreadsheet on her personal directory, the one she used for her own organizational notes that no one had ever asked to see, and she began to build a log. She was thorough by nature and obsessive by training, and the log was clean and precise and dated, and she put the Haverstone file notation at the top of it and went home. That night she did not sleep well, not because she was frightened, not yet, but because the pattern was already forming at the edges of her thinking, the way a shape forms in fog before it has fully resolved, and she recognized it the way she recognized all patterns, with that same quiet internal resonance, and it was not a small shape. It was not small at all. She was back at her desk at 7:53 the next morning, 23 minutes before her shift began, and she pulled the vendor registry again and started cross-referencing payment dates against building maintenance schedules. By 10:15, she had found 3 more vendor codes that did not correspond to real service orders. By noon, she had found 9. She ate her lunch at her desk without tasting it, a sandwich from the cafe 2 blocks over that she always ordered the same way, because sameness was efficient and efficiency was a form of armor. By 2:45, she had found 17 anomalous vendor codes with a combined irregular payment history totaling just over $1.4 million, routed through accounts attached to 4 of the Voss Group's 12 properties over 22 months. She looked at the number for a very long time. Then she closed the spreadsheet, locked it in a personal encrypted folder, and went back to filing, her face arranged in the expression it always wore in the office, which was the expression of someone who was simply there, simply working, simply unremarkable. She was so frightened that her hands were cold. She filed anyway. The number sat in her mind like a lit match, and she tried very deliberately not to think about whose money it was, who in this building might have put it there, and what happened to people who noticed things they were not supposed to notice. She tried. She was not entirely successful. She knew who Evander Voss was, of course. You could not work in any part of the Voss Group's operation, legitimate or otherwise, and not understand, on some fundamental, animal level that had nothing to do with organizational charts, that Evander Voss was the weight at the center of the structure around which everything else arranged itself. She had seen him twice in 14 months. Once in the lobby when his car arrived and the reception staff reorganized their entire physical orientation toward the entrance the way plants turn toward light, or the way smaller animals go very still when a larger animal moves into the clearing. And once through the glass wall of the second-floor conference room when she had been delivering a bound archive set to the records officer and she had glanced up and he had been there, standing at the head of the table, not speaking, not visibly doing anything at all except existing in that particular way that some men existed, which was with an authority that did not require demonstration. He was tall in the way that was not just height but proportion, broad-shouldered in the way that made the tailored black jacket look structural rather than decorative, dark hair cut close on the sides and left slightly longer on top, features that were angular and precise, a jaw that looked like someone had drawn it with intention. His eyes, from the distance of the glass wall and the archive box pressed against her sternum, looked very dark. She had looked away quickly. She always looked away quickly. It was part of the same skill set as the gray cardigan and the faded blouses and the desk in the basement. If you did not draw eyes, eyes did not settle on you, and if eyes did not settle on you, you were safe from the particular kind of assessment that came with being a soft, heavy woman in a space that preferred its women decorative and angular. She had been learning that lesson since she was 14 years old and had not stopped learning it since. So she looked away. She went back to the basement. She filed. She did not think about his eyes. She thought about the 17 vendor codes and the $1.4 million and the lit match in her mind. And she thought about it for 3 more days before she understood that she was not going to be able to simply set it down and walk away from it, because the money had not stopped moving. She checked the accounts each morning from her personal directory, careful, precise, leaving no trace of her queries in the system logs because she knew how to be invisible in data the same way she was invisible in rooms. And on the 4th morning, the number was not 1.4 million anymore. Someone had moved another payment through overnight. The total was 1.6. Someone was still doing it. Someone inside this building was still actively routing money through ghost vendors, and the Voss Group's accounting department had not caught it, and the partners upstairs had not caught it, and nobody in the 14 months that this had been happening had caught it, except a woman in a gray cardigan in a basement archive room who noticed things because she had made an art form of being invisible, and invisibility, it turned out, was excellent camouflage for seeing everything. On the fifth morning, Marin came in at 7:38 and locked her office door, which was not something she had ever done before and which felt, in the doing of it, like stepping off a curb into traffic and hoping the cars were paying attention. She opened her encrypted folder and ran the full cross-reference one final time, this time pulling the corporate registration data for each ghost vendor, the payment routing numbers, and the employee access logs for the accounting platform. She worked methodically and without haste, because haste created errors, and errors in this particular investigation would not be the kind you got to correct in a subsequent draft. What she found in the employee access logs made her sit back in her left-leaning chair and stare at the buzzing fluorescent light for a full 2 minutes without moving. The payments had been processed through 2 employee credentials, both belonging to members of the corporate accounting team on the 4th floor, not the basement. But the system timestamps showed the entries made on 3 different occasions after standard business hours, at times that should not have corresponded to those employees' building access logs. She ran the access logs against the timestamps. One of the employees, a senior accountant named Piers Drummond, had not badged into the building on any of those 3 dates. The other, a junior accounts manager named Callie Renner, had badged in but had exited at 6:15 on all 3 occasions, well before the timestamps on the fraudulent entries, which meant someone else had accessed the system using their credentials, someone who had their login information and did not want their own badge record attached to the transactions. Marin's hands were completely steady as she documented all of this, which surprised her, because her heart was moving very fast. She built the full report in her personal directory, clean, structured, fully sourced, the kind of forensic accounting summary that her graduate thesis advisor would have called elegant, and then she sat with it and thought very carefully about her next move. She could take it to the records officer, who would take it to the compliance department, who would take it to the partners. Except that if someone in this building had the system credentials and 4th floor access to run a 22-month ghost vendor scheme, the partners upstairs were either compromised themselves or surrounded by someone who was, and a compliance flag through normal channels would arrive on a desk where the wrong hands were waiting for it. She could take it to an external authority, which would be the correct civic answer, and the answer that would guarantee she was out of a job, and possibly in considerably more danger than that, because she had been in this building long enough to understand, at the structural, animal level, that the Voss Group's relationship to external oversight was not warm. She could do nothing, which was not something she was actually capable of, or she could take it to the center of the structure, to the weight at the center that everything arranged itself around. To Evander Voss, who had dark eyes and a jaw drawn with intention and who had, in 14 months, never once looked in the direction of the basement archive room. She stood up. She tucked her report into a plain manila folder. She straightened her gray cardigan. She went upstairs. The 4th floor was everything the basement was not. Marble tile that caught the light, walnut paneling, the discreet whisper of expensive climate control systems that actually worked. A reception desk staffed by a woman named Tara who wore structured dresses, and the precise expression of someone whose entire professional purpose was to be a beautiful obstacle. Marin had come up to the 4th floor twice in 14 months, both times for document deliveries, both times directed immediately to the records room and out again without any particular acknowledgement of her existence. She walked off the elevator now with the manila folder pressed flat against her side, and she crossed toward Tara's desk, and the woman's eyes moved over her, over the gray cardigan and the wider hips, and the clip in her hair that needed replacing, with the efficiency of a scanner deciding a package was not priority mail. "Deliveries are processed through the 3rd floor," Tara said, pleasantly. She had a pleasant voice, the way a locked door was pleasant, functional, and entirely impenetrable. "I need to speak with Mr. Voss," Marin said. Her voice did not shake, which she noted with a kind of distant pride. "I have a document requiring his direct attention. It's a financial matter." Tara's pleasant expression did not change. Mr. Voss's calendar is managed exclusively through executive scheduling. You can submit a request through the internal system, and someone will review it within 5 to 10 business days. This won't hold for 5 to 10 business days, Marin said, and there was something in her own voice that she recognized only after she heard it, a steadiness that she had not planned for, but that was apparently available to her when it was needed. 11, I think, said a voice from behind her. It was a low voice. Not loud, not raised in any way. It simply occupied the air it moved through with complete and total authority, the way a stone occupies water, and the temperature in the room changed in the way that Marin had observed it change when Evander Voss entered a space, which was that the air got very still. She turned. He had come from the corridor that led to the corner office, and he was closer than she expected, which meant her mental adjustment from the memory of him through a glass wall to the actual physical reality of him standing 8 feet away required a moment that she hoped she managed gracefully. He was in black, jacket, shirt, everything black, the jacket a charcoal so dark it swallowed light, and he was watching her with eyes that were, at this distance, the precise deep slate of very old ink. He was not looking at Tara, he was looking at Marin. I passed 11 vendors in my audit before the number started moving again, she said, because she had apparently decided that this was how she was introducing herself, and the decision was already made. I have 17 now, 22 months, 1.6 million, and it hasn't stopped. Something shifted in those ink-dark eyes. Not surprise exactly. Something more precise than surprise, something more like the specific attention of a person who has been looking for something for a very long time and has just had it placed directly in front of them. "Come in," he said. One word, not loud. Tara was very still behind Marin, which Marin felt rather than saw, and she followed Evander Voss down the corridor toward the corner office, the manila folder pressed against her side, her heart loud in her own ears, her footsteps very deliberate on the marble tile. His office had no fluorescent lights. This was the first thing she observed with the absurd specificity of someone who spent her days under humming tubes of cold white light, that his office ran on recessed warm fixtures and a standing lamp beside the seating area, and the natural gray November light from 2 tall windows overlooking the street below. And all of it together created an amber and shadow quality that felt, after the basement, almost startlingly human. He did not go behind his desk. He moved to the seating area, 2 dark leather chairs and a low table, and he gestured toward one of the chairs in the way that made clear it was not a suggestion. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, which meant she was looking up at him, and she was very deliberately not thinking about the way he occupied the space of the room, which was completely and without apparent effort, the way she was very deliberately not thinking about the fact that she had walked into the corner office of Evander Voss with a folder documenting what was almost certainly internal fraud against his organization, and what she did with the next 10 minutes would determine a significant number of future minutes in ways she could not fully calculate. "Tell me," he said. He said it the way people said things when they had said it before and people had learned to respond accordingly. Marin opened the folder on the table between them. She had organized it in sequence. Anomalous vendor codes, payment history, timestamp comparison, credential access analysis, registration audit, and she walked him through it without notes because she did not need notes. She had built it herself, and it lived in her mind with the same clean architecture it had on the page. Her voice was level. Her hands did not shake. She explained the ghost vendor structure, the routing mechanism, the timing pattern that suggested someone with administrative access was running the payments after hours under borrowed credentials to avoid direct system attribution. She explained what the 22-month timeline indicated about the scheme's origin point and how the escalating payment amounts suggested growing confidence, someone who had not been caught and was therefore being less careful. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that she was aware of it physically. the way you are aware of pressure at altitude. Evander Voss had sat down sometime during her report. She could not have said precisely when. And he was now leaning forward with his forearms on his knees and his dark eyes on the documents spread across the table, and his face had the still quality of something that had gone beyond expression into pure concentration. One of his hands rested on the edge of the table, the fingers loose, and she noticed that his hands were large, the knuckles well-defined, and she noticed that she had noticed this and redirected her attention firmly back to the documents. "How long have you been in the archive room?" he asked. He asked it without looking up from the documents. 14 months, she said. He looked up then. The ink-dark eyes found her face and held there, and it was the specific quality of being looked at rather than looked over that she recognized the way you recognize something you have not experienced recently, with a slight internal adjustment of scale, a recalibration of how much space you were allowed to take up. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maren Calloway," she said. "I work archive intake and classification, basement level." He looked at her for a moment in which the quality of the looking was not comfortable or uncomfortable but simply very complete, as though he was not seeing the gray cardigan or the clip that needed replacing, or any of the deliberate inoffensiveness that she had assembled around herself like a wall, as though all of that was simply not the most interesting thing about her, which was a conclusion she did not quite know how to hold. 14 months, he said, and the way he said it was not a question. "And you found this in 14 months, when my accounting team found nothing in 22. She did not point out that she had found it in considerably less than 14 months, which seemed like the kind of clarification that would not serve her. "I see patterns," she said instead, "in filings." He stood. He went to his desk and picked up his phone, not the desk phone, the personal one, and he sent a text that took him approximately 4 seconds. Then he set the phone down and looked at her again. "Stay here," he said. "Someone will come for the documents." He paused at the door of the office and looked back at her, with the same complete quality of attention. "Maren Calloway," he said, as though he was putting it somewhere specific, the way she put things in her own mind, in the category of things that would not be misfiled. Then he walked out. She sat in the warm amber light of his office and breathed slowly, and did not allow herself to think about the fact that her name had sounded different in his voice than it had ever sounded in anyone else's. She focused instead on the documents, and on the pattern, and on the lit match that was still burning. The man who came 20 minutes later was not someone she had seen before, which meant nothing, because she had seen only a small fraction of the people who moved through the Voss Group's 4th floor. He was compact and dark-eyed and moved with the particular economy of someone who had organized themselves around efficiency above all else, and he introduced himself as Nico and did not offer a last name and did not ask Maren for anything except the folder, which she gave him, and a verbal walkthrough of her primary findings, which she provided with the same methodical precision she had offered Evander Voss, and which Nico listened to with an expression of such careful neutrality that it told her, through its very deliberateness, that he already knew some of what she was saying, and was using her account to measure the distance between what he knew and what she had found. When she finished, he looked at her for a moment with those precise dark eyes. "You logged all of this in your personal directory," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. "Encrypted." "Since when?" 5 days ago. He nodded slowly. "I'll need the directory path." She gave it to him. He looked at her for one more moment, the same measuring quality in it. "Go back to the archive room," he said. "Don't discuss this with anyone. Don't access the vendor accounts or the payment logs again." He paused. "Someone will be posted on your floor." She understood what this meant. She stood up from the leather chair and straightened her cardigan and picked up her now empty folder, and the absence of the documents felt strange against her side, like setting down a weight she had been carrying for 5 days and finding that the muscles had formed around it. She went back to the elevator. She went back to the basement. The fluorescent light was humming. She sat down and began to file, and she kept her face arranged in its standard expression, and she did not think about ink-dark eyes or large, still hands, or the way her name had been placed somewhere specific, in a voice that did not raise itself for anything. She filed. She was very good at filing. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, there was a man she did not know sitting in the chair near the archive room entrance that had previously held only a broken laser printer and 3 boxes of outdated procurement records, and he was reading something on his phone with enormous apparent absorption and had not looked at her once, and she understood that this was precisely the point. Someone was watching the room. She was, for the first time in 14 months, someone whose location was being tracked. She could not have said with certainty whether this made her feel more frightened or something else entirely, something that she did not have a word for, something that had to do with the sensation of being seen by someone who was looking on purpose. 2 days passed. She filed. The man near the entrance changed shifts at 8 and at 4. Always a different face, always the same total absence of apparent interest in her that telegraphed, to anyone paying attention, exactly the opposite. On the morning of the 3rd day, Marin arrived at 7:41 to find that the broken laser printer and the procurement boxes had been removed from the corner near the entrance and replaced with a proper chair and a small table, and that the humming fluorescent fixture directly above her desk had been replaced overnight with one that ran silently. She stood in the doorway and looked at the silent light for a moment that was longer than was probably professional, and then she sat down and began to work. At 9:57, Nico appeared in the doorway. He looked at her with those precisely neutral eyes and said, "Mr. Voss wants you upstairs," and then he stepped back to let her pass. She closed the file she was working on. She stood. She looked down at the gray cardigan, which she was wearing over a muted plum blouse that was slightly less invisible than her usual palette, but only slightly, and she pressed her hands flat against the front of it once, briefly, the way you press a thing down when you want it to stay in place, and she followed Nico to the elevator. The 4th floor was the same marble and walnut and warm light, but the energy of it was different today in a way that Marin's pattern-sensing mind registered before she had consciously identified the source. There were 2 additional men she didn't recognize standing near the conference room, and the reception desk where Tara usually sat was occupied by a different woman who had the same precise professional stillness, but the kind of eyes that came from somewhere more operational than scheduling. Evander Voss was in the conference room with 3 other men whose body language told her immediately that they were in the category of people who operated inside the true structure of the Voss Group rather than its commercial front. She was shown to a chair outside the glass wall, and she waited. And through the glass she could see the conversation in the room, which she could not hear, and the quality of it was very clear even without sound. The 3 men were explaining something, and Evander Voss was listening with his hands flat on the table and his face entirely still. And then he said something, 1 sentence, and all 3 men stopped speaking simultaneously, the way all 3 men in any room apparently stopped speaking simultaneously when Evander Voss said 1 sentence in that particular tone, which was the tone of someone who had made a decision and was announcing it rather than discussing it. He looked up then, through the glass, directly at her. It was not the accidental meeting of eyes. He had known she was there, and he looked up with intention, directly to where she was sitting, and held the look for 2 seconds before returning his attention to the men across the table. Her lungs did a complicated thing that she did not examine. When the conference room door opened and the 3 men filed out, she noticed that none of them looked at her, which meant they had been instructed not to, which meant she was both known and specifically handled, and both of these things were new in ways that she was filing rapidly under the category of things she would process when she had the privacy to do so. Evander Voss appeared in the doorway. "Come in," he said. She came in. He closed the door behind her, which she noted, and he moved to the head of the table and remained standing, and she took a position on the side that felt less like choosing a seat and more like finding the place in a room that made structural sense, the way she always found it, quietly and without fuss. "Piers Drummond," he said. "You know the name." She nodded. He was one of the 2 employee credentials used to process the fraudulent payments, but the timestamps and badge records indicate he wasn't in the building on the nights the entries were made. Someone was using his credentials remotely, someone with access to his login information and to the corporate VPN, Evander said. She nodded again. "Which means someone with administrative IT access, or someone Drummond gave the information to voluntarily, or under some kind of leverage." "He gave it voluntarily," Evander said, and the way he said it was very calm and had no inflection, and told her everything she needed to know about what the past 48 hours had contained for Piers Drummond. She did not ask. "The person running the accounts," she said instead. "The actual entries." "Handled," he said. One word. She looked at him. He looked at her. The conference room had the same November light as his office, gray and even, and in it the angles of his face were very clear, and the ink-dark eyes were watching her with the same quality she had been filing away for 5 days, the quality of looking on purpose. "You saved this organization a significant amount of money," he said, "and you identified a structural vulnerability that my accounting team, my professional, well-compensated accounting team, had been adjacent to for almost 2 years without seeing it." She did not say anything, because what was there to say? "What I'd like to know," he said, and his voice changed slightly in the way it had not changed in anything he had said so far, dropped fractionally, became something less declarative and more deliberate, "is why the woman with a forensic accounting degree is sitting in my basement sorting accordion files." The room was very quiet. Outside the glass wall, the 4th floor moved in its discrete, efficient patterns. Maren looked at him steadily and told herself that she was not going to be embarrassed about the answer, that the answer was simply a practical history and not an indictment, and then she gave him the honest version anyway because she had walked into his office 5 days ago with a lit match, and there was no point becoming cautious now. "Because when I came for the interview," she said, "the position was listed as archive processing, and I had skills that were more than sufficient, and the role was in the financial documents sector of a company with an interesting structure, so I took it. And because nobody here has ever asked me what else I can do." She paused. "And because the basement was quiet." He looked at her for the length of time that it took for her to become aware, with the same slow recalibration of scale she had felt in his office, that she was taking up the correct amount of space in this room, that she was not too large for it or too soft for it, or too much of any of the things she had spent years training herself to make smaller, and that he was not looking at her as though any of that was a question. "That changes today," he said. It was a statement, not a question, not a proposal, not a subject for discussion. The same declarative certainty with which he had, from everything she had observed, arranged all the facts of his world. She thought about the gray cardigan and the clip in her hair, and the 14 months of accordion folders, and the lit match that had brought her upstairs, and the fraudulent vendor codes, and the silence above her desk, where a broken fixture had been replaced overnight, and she thought about the particular sensation of being seen by someone who was looking on purpose, and she said, "I know." And the right corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was something more deliberate than nothing, and he said, "Good." "Then we have things to discuss, Maren Calloway," and the way her name sat in his voice was still the same, somewhere specific, somewhere that did not misfile things. And the November light came through the tall windows and the room was warm, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly the right size for where she was standing. If you felt something in this story, you are not alone. This is exactly the kind of slow-burn brilliance meets danger romance that people tell us they think about for days afterward. Hit the like button if Maren made you want to stand up and cheer. And drop a comment below telling us what you thought the moment she walked into that office with her folder. Share this with one person who needs to hear a story about a woman whose invisibility was always just camouflage for seeing everything. And subscribe so you never miss the moment someone like Maren stops being the background of the sentence and becomes exactly what the whole story was always about.